If we back all the way up to the very beginning, you'll see that the focal point of this entire chapter is Peter, and that seems to be without argument. We didn't read the first half. We went through that last week, but if you go back, you'll see that Peter seems to be central to everything that's going on there. The first half of the chapter is sort of a prelude or a teaser of what's to come, and now the second half of the chapter really zeroes in on him and this private conversation that Jesus is having with him. Peter has had a sleepless night, as have his friends, and Peter has had a very rough morning at the point at which this conversation takes place. Particularly Peter. I think that for him it may have been a little bit worse than the others, though that's conjecture. I do find it interesting, though, that Jesus targets him, none of the others. Well, why is this so difficult for Peter? Well, for one, Jesus just caught Peter acting like his old self. No one wants to be caught by Jesus acting like their old self. And the fact that Jesus did is going to be a sting to the apostle. The idea here that Jesus has caught him acting like his old self is verified by the fact that Jesus is referring to Peter as his old self 3 times in a row, calling him Simon, son of Jonah. And now that was his given name, Simon was. Peter was the nickname that Jesus gave him when they first met. I believe that it was the first thing that Jesus spoke to him. Your name is Simon. From now on, you'll be called Peter also. And Peter means rock. And so from the very beginning, Jesus gave him a nickname that would identify him in who he would one day be, not who he currently was. Peter was no rock. And over the course of his ministry with Peter, to Peter, we've seen Peter vacillate between sort of this rock and this indecisive, foolhardy, immature bonehead. Really? I mean, nobody puts their foot in their mouth, as far as apostles are concerned, more than Peter does, over and over again. And when he does, Jesus refers to him as Simon. You're acting like your old self. And Jesus will do that to you. You're acting like your old self. And if you're a child of God, then you will be familiar with that sting that comes when Jesus makes you aware of how you're behaving. You're acting just like you used to before we met. So Peter has had a sleepless night and a rough morning. But truth be told, Peter's had a rough month. And this all began many weeks ago on the night before Christ's crucifixion, when Peter started thinking that he was doing a little better than he really was. He was becoming a little more self-confident than perhaps he should have been. And I think that that's usually where our problems begin, right there. You start to get a little too confident in how you're doing, and then things get worse from there. And well, they did for Peter anyway. He believed himself to be doing better than he really was. You remember that he was boasting that even if everybody else flees, I'm with you to the end. And Jesus goes, oh? By tomorrow morning you'll deny me 3 times. So you're not doing as good as you think you are, Peter. And this was, of course, some weeks ago, the night of Christ's arrest and crucifixion. At that point, after having been made aware of his moral frailty, Peter got spiritually complacent. We see this pretty clearly when he fell asleep after Jesus told him to stay awake and keep praying. You remember that happened there in Matthew chapter 26. Now, at that point, Peter has become so morally lax that now he's able to do what only yesterday would have been unthinkable, which was, ready? Attempted homicide. You remember that part in the garden when Peter drew his sword and tried to kill a man? I mean, the followers of Christ shouldn't actually be known for trying to murder people. And yet at that point, he had become so morally lax, so irresponsible, so spiritually complacent that murder seemed rational. So at that point in his life, Peter was drained of all spiritual integrity there. And at that point, he's got nothing left to keep him from denying Jesus at all, which he did in rapid-fire succession. 1, 2, 3, I don't know the man, I don't know the man. Even cursing the name of Christ And now this. Now this. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only gospel of all four that records this conversation that took place between Peter and Jesus by the sea. So we're being given a glimpse into the behind-the-curtain sort of goings-on between Jesus and one of his own. It's a conversation. It's a brief conversation. You'll notice that. Not too many verses here. Not a whole lot of red ink used in recording this conversation for us. It's brief. That's because Jesus is a man of few words. You ever found that to be true? That Jesus has a way of being very clear and very concise? He's not known for mincing words. He says what he means. He means what he says. And once he's said it, he's done. So it's a brief conversation. It's also a painful conversation. I'd like to believe that all the conversations I've ever had with Jesus were wonderful. All the times when he's involved himself in my life and entered into my conscience, that it made me feel wonderful, but it doesn't. It's oftentimes very, very painful. Well, that's because Jesus is one who's more concerned with the truth than with a person's feelings, and that even goes for the people he loves. He'll hurt your feelings. If what he has to say to you is true, if what's true will save you from further harm, he doesn't mind hurting you a little bit if it will save you from eventual and irreversible damage. He'll hurt your feelings. So this is a brief conversation. It's a painful conversation. It's also a very memorable conversation. This is some things here being said that Peter doesn't forget. In fact, he makes mention of this conversation at the very end of his life in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. When he's commanding other pastors, shepherd the flock of God. You need to feed the sheep. You need to tend the lambs. Feed them, shepherd them. Believe me, you want it to go well when Jesus Christ returns. So what Jesus says to Peter here, feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. Peter's not going to forget this conversation. No time soon. I'll bet that to this day, Peter still remembers it. If Peter has ears to hear what's going on earth, I bet he's hearing this sermon and going, oh, here we go again. I remember this one. Now, here's a big question to begin our study this morning. Why is Jesus targeting Peter? That's a valid question because you remember he's not alone there. He had 6 other disciples with him, it says, okay? They're listed in verse 2 of our chapter. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, and then 2 others of his disciples that aren't named, but we can surmise that one of them might have been Andrew. That was his brother. So Peter's got relatives there. He's got friends there, and then another disciple. We're not sure who those 2 are, but we do know that Peter is the one being targeted by Jesus, not Thomas. And I'm going, why not Thomas? Thomas is the guy who doubted. Like, why not come after Thomas and go, Thomas, seriously, are you going to doubt me for the rest of your life? Because we got work to do in India. And why not Nathanael? Nathanael was one of all the rest of the disciples who forsook Jesus and fled on the night of his arrest. Like, don't you think that needs a little confronting? Like, Nathanael, seriously, I'm putting the future of the world in your hands. You can't be running away all the time because you're freaked out. Could have been James. Right? The sons of Zebedee, James and John. Why doesn't he target James or John? They went back to their old life of fishing just as much as Peter went back to his old life of fishing. But Jesus seems to leave all of them alone, and he goes after Peter, and I wonder why. I believe I have the answer to that. I believe that Jesus is dealing with Peter like this because Peter's the leader. If you read through the Gospels, you'll notice that Peter is always listed or often listed first. At least he is when the full list of disciples are given. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, it says, and Jesus chose these 12. First, Simon Peter. It says the same thing in Mark chapter 3. It's given the same order in Luke chapter 6. In Acts chapter 1, verse 13, again, the apostles are listed, and Peter is listed first. All through the Gospels, Peter is presented as the spokesman of the group. You remember in Luke chapter 18, verse 28, when Peter spoke on behalf of all of them, saying, we have left everything to follow you, Jesus. In John chapter 6, verse 69, Peter, speaking up on behalf of everybody else with him, he says, "We believe that you are the Holy One of God." You remember in Mark chapter 8, Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" addressing his disciples. And they all gave various answers. And then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And again, Peter spoke up on behalf of everybody. We believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He was the spokesman. He was first. He was the leader. You notice in verse 3 of the chapter, it was Peter who says, "I'm going fishing," and everybody else tags along. Jesus had designated him the leader, and I don't know what it was about the man's character, but he had just something about him that people wanted to follow. So he's a leader whether he's a good one or not. See, that's the thing about leadership. If God designates you as a leader, you are one whether you're doing a good job of it or not. Now, even if Peter doesn't fully get it at this point, God has plans to make him the apostle to the Jews. Those are big shoes to fill. When God makes you the one to carry the great responsibility of bringing the gospel to an entire race, they are big shoes to fill. But because he's walking in those shoes, he's now accountable for other people, the Jews, God's people, Jesus' sheep. And Peter's not sitting in a very pretty position here because he's just shown himself to be doing a pretty terrible job. He's supposed to be leading the Jews, God's people, Jesus' sheep, closer to the Lord, into greater obedience. And where is he leading them? Back to the sea to go fishing. He's off to a pretty poor start, wouldn't you say? And how is Peter going to function as an apostle if he can't even lead his own friends and family? How is he going to fulfill the great things that God has planned for his future when he can't even do the little thing that he's called to right now? And I'll tell you this, please pay attention to what I'm saying here. Jesus deals more severely with those to whom he has entrusted others. If he's made you responsible for people in any way, then God will hold you at a higher rate of accountability than others. Peter is going to be held responsible for human souls. There is no greater responsibility than that, because we're speaking of eternity. And you think, no, God would never place that kind of responsibility into the hands of a fallible man, not when it comes to eternity. But he has. It's just that we don't want that responsibility. You and I are responsible for each other, and some of us are more responsible for each other than others are. If Jesus cares about Peter, which he does, then he's going to do what he can to safeguard Peter from the trouble that he's going to incur for poor leadership, which is why he's targeting him right here. Peter's going to get in a heap of trouble if Jesus doesn't address his weaknesses and deal with him accordingly, even if it hurts a little bit. And if Jesus cares for those in Peter's flock, which he does, then he's going to keep Peter on a short leash. Because the decisions that Peter makes and the example Peter sets is going to affect the eternal welfare of anyone that God places beneath his care. So, take that to heart, husbands. God has made you head of household. That comes with a heavy responsibility that some, perhaps too many, overlook and dismiss. Not a lot of parents in this room, but some of you will be one day, no doubt. Take heed, parents, to whom God has entrusted children. Take heed, husbands, to whom God has delegated a wife. If you've been given by God the responsibility of leading and protecting and raising people in any of God's institutions, in marriage, in the home, in the church, this includes me, then expect Jesus, okay? Anticipate that Jesus will have occasional conversations with you about that, especially when you're failing. Especially when you're failing. Because he cares about those people that he's entrusted to you, and he cares about you. as one to whom he would entrust others. So, by the way, if and when Jesus should confront you about your failure, it's not because he's done with you. It's because he's just trying to get things going. That's what he's doing with Peter. This isn't the end of Peter's ministry. This is the beginning of his ministry. And that's why Peter is being targeted by Jesus. Well, Jesus has just cooked breakfast for Peter and his friends. And I would assert that Peter didn't deserve breakfast. Is that fair? I don't think Peter did anything to earn it here. You know what he has earned? A good whooping. If he deserves anything, it's for Jesus to pull him aside and just slap him up a little bit and go, "What were you thinking?" But he doesn't. He cooks some fish and bread. And that meal that they've just eaten in verse 15 is a demonstration of grace and mercy. And honestly, I don't even know if Peter had an appetite at that point. After having just been caught by Jesus acting like your old self, sometimes you're really not in the mood for mercy. You don't really have much of an appetite for grace at that point. You'd rather starve to death. But take note, if Jesus ever offers you mercy, if he ever extends grace, you had better humble yourself and take it whether you feel like eating or not. It's the best thing you could do. It's the best thing Peter could have done. Even if he's so tied up in knots. You remember that they were so nervous about this that nobody's even speaking. They hardly had a word to say. I can't imagine there was much of an appetite. You say, yeah, but they were working all night and they hadn't eaten anything. I don't think that really matters. When you've so spiritually failed that you don't even want to talk to your Lord, well, Jesus' words are always best received on a full stomach. And I don't mean fish. I mean mercy. You ever found that to be true? Mercy is when you don't get what you know you got coming. And Jesus goes, I'm not going to whoop you. I'm going to cook you breakfast. And I'm going to commune with you. I'm going to try to reestablish this relationship that you keep messing up. I'm here for you. Are you hungry? Here, let's have some food. It's going to be the best fish you've ever had, by the way. He's like a 5-star Michelin guy, you know? I mean, if he's cooking, you want to eat it. You ever found that after Jesus has extended mercy like that to you, that you'll listen to anything he says after that? Best received on a full stomach. So Jesus asked Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? Commentators really wished that they knew what Jesus was referring to there when he said these. Every commentary I read is scrambling to try and figure it out and nail it down. Was he talking about the other disciples? You know, do you love me actually, Peter, more than these guys? Which is valid, I suppose, because it wasn't too long ago that Peter was boasting that even if they all run away from you, I'm not gonna. You know, sort of like, I love you more than they do, Jesus, and I know that their love for you is fickle, you know. Some days they do and some days they don't, and their love for you is circumstantial. Mine isn't, I guarantee. Even if they run away, I'm with you no matter what. And so now Jesus has every reason to go, do you really love me more than these guys? Because remember the conversation we had before I died? That would have cut to the heart. Maybe he wasn't referring to those men. Maybe he was referring to the fish, to fishing, to everything associated with it. You know that the beach would have been strewn with gear. They had drugged the net onto the shore. Their boat is still floating out there, you know, and there's 153 fish flopping all around. Jesus could easily have gone, do you love me more than these? More than what? Fish, fishing, the nets, the boat, this life. That too would have cut to the heart. So we don't know. We don't know what he's referring to. All he says is, do you love me more than these? Does it matter what he's referring to? I mean, aren't we supposed to love Jesus supremely? Is there anything that you love more than Jesus? That's the problem. Was it the other guys? Was it the fish? Either way, Jesus is asking Peter if he loves him like he deserves to be loved. That's the question this morning. You love Jesus? Yeah, of course I love Jesus. I mean, who in here would go, no, not really? No, we're Christians. We come to church. It's what we do, right? We love Jesus. Yeah. Do you love him like he deserves to be loved? That's all he wants to know. The word love there, Jesus, now here's where our English translations fail us, because the word love is used like 8 dozen times in this short passage. And they're different Greek words. Jesus, when he says, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? The Greek word that Jesus is using there is agapaó. It's Greek. That word means living life. That definition of love means to live life according to the Lord's preferences instead of your own. Now that's a love that God defines, not us. Are you living the way God wants you to live? That's what Jesus is asking. Are you living your life for your own preferences or for mine? Now, what if Jesus asked you that question? Are you living your life the way he prefers, or are you living your life the way you prefer? And no one gets to go, well, like in terms of what? Like what I do on Sundays? Because I'm here, so I'm doing it the way you prefer, because this is where you want me to be on Sunday. No, he's going, no, when you go to work on Monday. The relationship that you have with your unmarried fling. What you do in your spare time. The hobbies you have, the interests, the way you entertain yourself, where you go to find pleasure. Are you doing these things according to God's holy preferences, or is it just kind of, that's where God's off limits? He gets my Sunday, I get Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Well, Peter knows that the answer to that question is no. He's not. Right? Jesus is going, like, Peter, just curious. If I preferred to meet you on a mountain, would you meet me on the mountain even if you preferred to go fishing by the sea? Now, how do you say yes to that when you know it ain't true? So Peter knows the answer is no, but he wants to affirm his love for Christ. So knowing that he's not measuring up to Jesus' definition of love, Peter does what a lot of us might do. He lowers the standard for himself by using a similar word but different definition so that he can still say that he loves Jesus. So when Jesus says, Simon, son of Jonah, do you agapaó me? Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I, now here's a different Greek word, phileo you. Phileo simply means affectionate friendship. That's all. It's definitely a sort of substandard level of the love that Jesus was defining there. Do you love me with a supreme love? Yeah, I love you like a buddy. We're buds. Yeah, well, you have affection for Jesus, but that's not what he's asking. Jesus isn't worried about your affections for him. Jesus isn't asking Peter how he feels. He's confronting Peter about the way he's living. And Jesus does the same thing in verse 16. And just like before, he keeps pointing back to action and behavior. That's why he's saying, feed my sheep. Feed my lambs. He keeps giving him behaviors, actions to verify and give ultimate proof of the kind of love that he's after. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Peter's not doing that. Peter's not feeding his sheep. No one's following Peter into green pastures. If Peter's leading them anywhere, it's back to their old life, fishing. Oh, yeah, well, good luck trying to convince Jesus that you love him when you're failing to prove it by the way you live. It's impossible to do that. So we can sit today and say, oh, I love Jesus, and I love Jesus, and I sing songs about how much I love Jesus, and I put my hands in the air, and I sing real loud, yeah, but that's not what I think he's paying closer attention to the way we're living during the week than he is to what we're singing on the Sunday morning. You have affections for Jesus, that's great, but that's not what he's asking. In verse 17, he said to him the third time, does anyone learn anything the first time? Like, seriously. Christians, we like to think that we're just great students and that we're just ready and eager to take the Lord's instruction and obey. Does anybody learn anything the first time, or is Peter the only one with a thick head like that? I'd like, and that this isn't a cut on you, this is a cut on us. We, myself included, tend to need the Lord to repeat himself over and over again, don't we? Before we really get the point. And you notice Peter isn't grieved until the third time. So it's like he's not getting it. It's not sinking in until he goes around that mountain finally for the third time. Peter knew that he wasn't loving Jesus like he should have been, but I think that he keeps dismissing his own culpability. He keeps insisting that he does. I don't love you like I should, but I love you on some level. And so now Jesus is even questioning him on whether he loves him on that level. Because in verse 17, Jesus himself is even using the word phileo. So when Jesus says, do you love me, in verse 17, he's not saying, do you agapaó me? He's saying, do you phileo me? If I was to paraphrase that entire conversation, starting in verse 15, it would sound like this. Jesus says, Peter, do your actions, the way you live your life, reflect love for me? And Peter says, my affections do. Jesus says, no, but does the way you live indicate that you love me? And Peter says, well, my affections do. And Jesus says, can you really say you even have affection for me when you live like this? Do you even like me? And Peter here at this point is understandably grieved. Right? Because it's one thing to know that you're not really loving Jesus like you should. It's another thing to realize that Jesus would agree with you. Like, could we all agree in this room that we're not probably loving Jesus like we should? Now, it's one thing for me to tell you that. It would be another for Jesus to walk in the room and go, none of you are loving me like I deserve, and then walk out. That'd be a heavy sermon, wouldn't it? Would we not likewise feel grieved? That's a spiritual punch in the stomach that leaves you feeling winded. 3 times in a row, Jesus is saying, feed my sheep. But if you notice, each of those 3 commands are slightly different from one another. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, and then feed my sheep. There's a difference between feeding and tending. There's a difference between sheep and lambs. The difference between sheep and lambs is obvious. Level of maturity. The difference between feeding and tending is, in the one sense, feeding that's spiritually nourishing, providing nourishment, instruction, truth. Tending follows the lines of discipline. Jesus says, provide this for my people. What Jesus is doing is providing a composite picture of what Peter's wonderful, even if it's challenging, what his wonderful future holds. Feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. Listen, without even knowing exactly what all that means, though we do know a little bit of what that means, I could say this: Peter has an exciting future. There is hope infused in what Jesus is telling him, commanding him, and there should be a little bit of excitement, okay? If you will follow Jesus and you will repent of sin, you will not be bored. God indeed has great plans. And Peter's life really is just beginning if he will faithfully and fully obey. Now, Peter's future is beyond his ability to succeed on his own. Is Peter able to feed the Jewish nation? Is Peter able to tend the Jews? Is he capable of being an apostle? No. He's hardly capable of leading a half a dozen men on a fishing excursion. This guy would make a terrible, charter guide. Those things where you spend a ton of money to go out on a boat and catch big fish. They caught nothing. He can't even do that without Jesus' help. How's he going to succeed as an apostle to the Jews? He's not without God's help. This is beyond him. Super way beyond him. Well, these aren't instructions that Peter's just supposed to take and run with as if he was capable of doing it in the strength of his flesh or of his own accord. Not at all. These are instructions, these are marching orders being given by Jesus that are meant to keep him in step with Jesus every day for the rest of his life until he's dead. And if he does that, it will be a very exciting life, a very rewarding, not just life, but eternity. All he has to do is faithfully and fully obey. That's quite the opposite of what he knew he deserved from Jesus. Peter's future is not dismal. There is purpose. Jesus has given him hope. Jesus has provided Peter with eternal value. These are all the things, purpose, hope, and value. These are all the things that a life apart from Jesus knows nothing of. Amen to that? Because we all have been there. If you're a Christian today, you have a BC life. You know what I mean? Those days that you wasted spinning your wheels in the strength of your flesh, trying to make a go of it. And then Jesus went along, and I hope that it's come about that he cracked your knuckles and went, no more, and that you responded in faith to the life that he had for you, and you've realized, at least by now, that there is purpose and hope and value in this one and not the other one. I hope that kind of anchors you to the life with Christ and safeguards you against the life without him. That's what he's doing to Peter here. You want to go back to fishing now, Pete? Do you see how empty that is? Do you want to fish? Or do you want to feed my lambs? Choice is yours. Choice is yours. And the offer is so good that Jesus feels free to tell him what it's going to look like if he goes down this road. You're going to die. When you were a younger man, you used to go where you wanted, but if you're going to follow me, please understand that sooner or later, you're going to be captured, and you're going to be restrained, and you're going to be led where you'd rather not go. And he said this to indicate by what death he would die. Church history tells us that Peter would eventually be crucified. Jesus, in so many words, just told him that that's where following him would lead. But the offer to follow him at this point is so good in comparison to what's being offered by not following him that Peter's ready to die. And then Jesus goes, follow me. And what does Peter do? Follows him. It doesn't say that, but it doesn't need to. At this point, Peter is so spiritually conditioned to leave the old life behind that he actually follows Jesus. But no one will until they've been conditioned in a similar way. Until you fully realize how crummy the old life was, we're probably going to be dipping back into it. How frequently, I don't know. How frequently do you? Because if you're still doing that, then you don't believe that what Jesus has is better. And don't call the life you're living right now following him. Is it following him? Yeah, to a degree, but it's not what it could be if you would leave everything once and for all and follow him to wherever it is that he takes you. Peter by himself is not capable of doing this. But Peter, just like any one of us, is capable of doing anything if he's got Christ in his life. Isn't that what the Apostle Paul said? He said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In full agreement with what Jesus said in John 15. Without Jesus, you can do nothing. But with him, all things become possible. The Numerical Bible has a note in there that says, as Peter descends step by step, the ladder of humiliation, step by step, the Lord follows him with assurance of the work for which he is destined. So Peter is just getting knocked down, humbled, weakened, and there's Jesus right with him going, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be awesome. We can do this together, Peter. Don't you see that when you fail, it's because you've left me. If I'm with you, you can never fail. This is going to be awesome. It's scary, right? It's like spelunking. You know what spelunking is? When you're like down into the depths of the earth, like miles down, and pretty soon it's just dark, you can't see nothing. It's like, how deep does this go? I don't know. Well, where does it take me? I don't know. I can't see. Yeah, I know. Do you want to keep going? Yes and no. And Jesus is right beside you, right there next to you. You can't see him. It's too dark. But you can hear him. A little further. Let's go further. Okay. Just a little. And then, bzz. Is that good? Sure. Okay, let's go further now. Oh. Really? Yeah. Bzz. Is that good? Isn't that the game we play? Jesus is going, you can trust me. I know exactly where I am. I can see through the dark. You've got sturdy rope. And the worst thing that could ever happen is you hang there in midair by yourself while Jesus keeps going without you. Now you're alone. Peter was a very weak man, like many of us in this room are weak men and women. But there is no more noble life to live than the one Christ has called you to live. And there is no possible way to live that life unless Jesus has in fact called you to live it. And if he has, it suddenly becomes possible. Anyone in this room who humbly answers that call and follows Jesus is going to fulfill their destiny, and that's what we're after here. You are created by God with purpose, but many will live without purpose until they lock into a life with Christ. And when they do, they will then begin to fulfill that destiny for which they were created. Those who refuse will never know why they were born. And you can be a Christian all your life, and you go to church, cradle to grave, and you pray and you read your Bible, but you so disregard the specific will of God for your life, and you make no attempt to really wrestle until you find it, that you skate through life never really knowing why you were born. You live a mediocre life. You are status quo Christianity. That was Peter. But Peter wasn't ordained to fish. He was created to love Jesus by feeding sheep. And right here at this point in the narrative, he's closer than ever to finding that out. So Jesus tells him how he's going to die in verses 18 and 19. Well, this is crazy because in Luke chapter 22 and verse 33, Peter had expressed his heart's desire as strange as it may be for some people, Peter had a desire in his heart, and he expressed this in Luke 22, to die with Christ. He said in that verse, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And you can kind of, I don't know, can you relate to that? That sort of impulsive Christian fervor that's like, I'm ready, I'd die. I'd like to believe that I would die for Christ. But usually, you're saying that when you're at home on the couch. You know what I mean? When you're most comfortable, when you're not being stared in the face by all things evil and opposing to the Christian life. And so it's easiest to express it when all's well. Peter falls apart once that comfort leaves. And yet we have that desire. Some of us in here have that desire, as strange as it may be. And there's a desire like that, which is not uncommon among those who have a great affection for Jesus. We understand the value of sacrifice. There's a lot of Christians who have strong feelings about making a sacrifice to the Lord, even including all that they've got, including their life. They want to give Jesus everything. They believe that they're willing to die for him. But a lot of those same Christians eventually find themselves lacking the depth of love to actually make such a sacrifice when the opportunity comes. That's where we fall apart, is in the realm of love. When I won't follow through, when I can't carry out what I have decided in my feelings and my affections for Jesus to do, it says that I'm lacking in the love that's expected. Peter was one of those Christians. You remember on the night of Christ's arrest, Peter found himself weak in this area. Instead of risking his life to confess Christ, he denied him to save it multiple times. And so what Jesus is saying to him this morning is no doubt haunting him. Have you ever found yourself in that position where you were given an opportunity that you thought you wanted, and then God went, here, do it then, and you went, ah! And you failed? Or is it just me? Has it never happened to you that you had some pious fantasy about giving all for Jesus? Becoming a hero in church and in heaven, only to buckle like a coward when it came time to just speak up a little bit? Has it never happened that you determined to take a personal stand once and for all against the sin in your life and kill it dead like Goliath, only to fall again at the slightest temptation? And you weren't as strong or as brave or as Christian as you had thought or hoped or desired. Like Peter wanted to die for Jesus, but he missed his opportunity on the night of his arrest. But now, listen, the Lord reassures him that what he'd failed to do in his own strength would eventually be granted to him according to God's will. I know you want to die for me. And I know that you failed when you had the opportunity, but here Jesus is going, I guarantee you, one day you'll get to. So this isn't bad news to Peter, like, oh no, I'm going to get crucified one day. This is, I'm going to be crucified. I think there's joy in this. When God grants you the ability to face your greatest fears for His glory, and you conquer what once freaked you out so badly, and you know that God is pleased, and you know that you're doing His will, and you know that it's costing you everything, and you're glad to let go of it, that's joy. And it's wonderful to know that Jesus won't let anybody's failures change God's destiny. Peter will glorify God. All he needs to do is accept the invitation to follow Jesus, which he does. And I think at verse 20, Peter has reached an unprecedented level of spiritual maturity. I think that this guy is stronger than he's ever been. Probably, in his own mind, at his weakest, But from where I'm standing, I think Peter is more prepared to conquer the world than ever before. Well, the Bible says that when we're weak, then God is strong. And that's what we're after. If we're going to conquer the world or do anything great for the Lord at all, then we need to be weak so that he can be strong. And that's when the work gets done. It's when we're strong that nothing happens. So I'm looking at this and going, boy, by verse 20, Peter is ready to go. More than at any other point in his life, more than at any other point in the gospel accounts, do we see him as prepared to follow Jesus as he is right now. He's been following him for 3.5 years, but it hasn't been going very well. He's been back and forth, but now he's been given a new start on life. It's go time. And now catch this. The very first thing that he does is to start comparing God's plan for his life with God's plan for someone else's life and confuse the two. Oh, no, Peter, no. We had such high hopes. In verse 20, we thought, all right, he's ready. And the first thing he does, well, what about John? What's going to happen with him? Like, what's God's will for his life? How does it compare to mine? Well, part of the challenge of following Jesus for you and I is always going to be to make sure that we're living how Jesus told us to live, not how Jesus told someone else to live. From my vantage point, I see that mistake being made all the time. And in this flock, people not necessarily following Jesus, but following the herd. Do you know how dangerous it is to follow sheep instead of a shepherd? Listen, if one sheep goes over a cliff, do you know what happens? Everyone else follows that sheep over the cliff except for one guy, and that's the shepherd. Jesus won't take you off a cliff. He's the great shepherd. We make a great mistake when we look side-eyed at everybody else around us and go, well, and I should probably be doing that too. How are you ever going to find the will of God for your life if you're too concentrated on perfecting the will of God for someone else's life? If you think you're following Christ, but in truth you're giving all your attention to how other people are doing it and then trying to emulate that, you have at that point stopped following Christ. Peter, look at verse 19, he starts following Jesus again. And no sooner has he begun following Jesus than Jesus has to come and say in verse 22, follow me again. So he followed him for a verse. And Jesus has to say, follow me. Okay, eyes on Jesus. Eyes on Jesus. I'm going to do what Jesus tells me to. Hey, but what are they doing? Follow me. Okay, eyes on Jesus. I'm following Jesus, and it's Sunday, and now I'm into Monday, and it's, all right, I'm doing this. And then pretty soon I'm going, whoa, what are they doing? Like, how do they handle it? No, follow me. Okay. You have to understand how much trouble you can get in as soon as you take your eyes off of Jesus, just like Peter has done here. His focus is on John, his buddy, who's got just as many problems as Peter does. How many disciples of Christ, even today in modern times, believe that they're following Jesus when all they're doing is copycatting somebody else who's following Jesus? A big mistake is made when you think your Christian life should look just like somebody else's Christian life. And might I say, it's an equally big mistake to think that everybody else's Christianity should look just like yours. There may be some similarities, but there will be some glaring differences. We know that this is John's gospel. We know that John is the one that's being referred to in verse 20. Even though his name isn't given, he's identified as being the one who had leaned on Jesus at supper, asking him, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? Well, that was John. In verse 24, John says This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Do we have any reason to doubt John? What incentive does he have to lie about all this? Because he just wants to look like an idiot? Because only a madman would write this stuff down if it weren't true. And only a madman would risk their life, like John did, to spread what he's written all over the world if it weren't true. John says, you might not believe it, but I do. And he says there are many other things that Jesus did. There are many other things that Jesus did, which is John's way of saying what Jesus did to Peter isn't at all uncommon. Peter wasn't the only one that Jesus ever targeted. Peter wasn't the only one who was ever made by Christ to feel inadequate. Peter wasn't the only one whom Jesus worked in to strengthen them in God's resources rather than their own, so that this individual, like Peter, could succeed in doing God's will. Jesus has been doing this many times over in perhaps your life also. This is not uncommon. Chapter 21 is not uncommon at all. It's predictable. It's predictable that we won't love Jesus like he deserves to be loved, and it's just as predictable that he'll love you anyway, even if you don't deserve it. It's normal for Jesus to not give up on people who don't love him like he demands or deserves to be loved. Never forget that Jesus is always more devoted to you than you are to him. He always loves you more. He always tops it. Like you're never better toward him than he is toward you. Always wins, Jesus does. Well, in Luke chapter 22, before any of this started, Jesus had told Peter that Satan was targeting him. He said, hey, Peter, Satan has asked me if he can have you. He wants to sift you like wheat. He wants to take you out of the game. And Jesus says, but I prayed for you. I prayed for you. I prayed that your faith would not fail. He didn't pray to keep Peter from falling. He prayed to keep Peter from failing. And there's a difference. Sometimes it's God's will for us to fall. Sometimes it's God's will for us to experience a momentary fall for our own good. It can work in a person like it did for Peter to help them see the pitiful condition of their own heart. It can work in your life to humble you as it should. It can work to show you that you're not as stable as you might have assumed you were. And God might allow you to momentarily fall in order to rescue a person from permanent destruction. So, will you fall as a Christian? Yeah. You have and you will. But that's not the issue. Will you fail? Not if the Lord has anything to do with it. I think Jesus does this kind of work in anyone and everyone who is his. We are his sheep. If we didn't have him as the good shepherd, we'd be all over the place. Over cliffs and tangled up in barbed wire and God knows where else. But he somehow keeps us on the straight and narrow, doesn't he? I mean, isn't it neat if you take a look back at the course of your Christian life and you go, man, I should have been disqualified here, and here, and then here. when was I ever qualified? And yet here we are, still in the game, still allowed to serve, still doing something with our life that I think has eternal value, or at least I hope it does. Still allowed to seek and to walk within the will of God, like he hasn't kicked us out of the club. What a guy. This is some shepherd that we're dealing with here, isn't it? Well, he's done a lot of work in our lives, that's for sure. And this is just a tiny little fraction of the greater church. And a tiny little fraction of church's history. So I can only imagine how much additional work the Lord has done. John says there are many other things that Jesus did. So many that if they were all written down into books, the world wouldn't be a big enough library. Well, you know what I think, and this is my opinion. You can take it for what it's worth. In my opinion, the things that Jesus does are being written down one by one. And since the world itself can't contain them, I believe they're being kept in heaven. The Bible says that we're poems that God is writing. The Bible says that. Ephesians 2:10. The Bible says that we are letters written. God's writing this stuff down, and it's called your life. And when he's finished writing that chapter, he's going to take you home and archive you in heaven. And there you'll be in the biggest library of all the universe for eternity. And it will be one of those libraries that when you walk in, you just go, oh. You know, we've got that sort of theme here that says our life is a story. Let's make it good. You know how to make it good? You make the story of your life good by letting him write it. And too many of us have been holding the pen for far too long, trying to pencil in our own destiny. And it's not pretty. It's not exciting to read. It's the same chapter that's been written over and over and over again by everybody else in this godless world. And Jesus says, let me write it. You want your life to be a story that counts? Then hand him the pen. Do the will of God no matter what it takes. Your life might not be flawless. No one's ever was except for Christ. But in the will of God, even your sins and your mistakes will work out for good if you love him. That's what it says in Romans. All things work together in the lives for good, in the lives of those who are called according to his purposes and those who love him. So here's the question then. Do you love Jesus more than anything else this morning? We know the answer is no, but we all want to say yes. Do your actions confirm or deny that you have love for him? Take a look at the way you're living. If there's sin in there, you're doing what you know is wrong. This is on you. You don't love him. And Jesus comes a third time and goes, do you even like me? That's a big question in our culture because I think that the word love in our culture has been so watered down that sometimes the word like carries a stronger connotation. So we can all sit here today and say, well, I love Jesus. Let me ask you today, do you even like him? Yeah, you love him, but do you like him? Do you like him? There's only two people in this room who know the answer to that question, you and him. Do you love Jesus? I don't know. Does Jesus love you? You better believe it. You had better. Father, does any of our love measure up to Jesus' love? And we know that it doesn't need to be perfect. It simply needs to be sincere. And it needs to be of the kind that has the capacity to translate into a life of obedience, because to insist that we love when that love is always hidden is foolish. And we're the only ones fooled by it. No one else is believing in it. I know I'm loved. We all know whether we're loved or not. It's easy to tell. And we all know that words are cheap. So to insist that we love really doesn't go very far, but to live like we do, that's what you're after. Please strengthen us in the way that you did with Peter. Confront those areas of our life that we're being too self-permissive in, where we're dismissing our own spiritual failures, and pretending that we are in a right relationship with you and we know we're not. Help us, Lord, to see those errors and then give us the strength and the insights that we need to make the corrections necessary to follow you. Help us, Lord, to keep our eyes on you. You're the great shepherd. You're the only one that can take us through the darkness. May we trust you and may we love you. And I pray that we would get to experience that before we're dead. I don't want to pacify myself by sort of relying on what I'll have for depth of relationship when I'm dead. Well, sure, then I'll love you perfectly, and then we'll be together. But I want to experience that now because I believe it's possible. No doubt it is through Christ who makes all things possible. Please help us with that. Help us to love you. We want to love you. In the truest and deepest and greatest sense of love, according to your definition, that there is to be lived. That's what we want to experience, and we know that that's what you want to experience. And so let there be that kind of relationship being built between us and you. We love you this morning, but help us to do it even more than we do now.